Okay, what's the question?
What is mortality? What does it mean? What context is it in a hospital?
It's quite an odd word, isn't it? Because you kind of get used to it when you work in a hospital, but I think as a member of the public you wouldn't even necessarily understand it. At its simplest, it's just deaths and death rates.
So how do we measure that and how is it used?
At its simplest, you just count how many people die and you divide it by how many people come into the hospital. So at its crudest, and there is a measure called crude mortality, which you might split by elective and non-elective deaths. So electively, you wouldn't expect there to be any mortality at all, because you've elected to come into hospital. Non-electively, you've come in as an emergency of some sort, and you might expect a higher death rate associated with that.
So are there any other forms rather than just crude?
Yeah, so there's quite a history now of looking at what you'd call adjusted mortality, and the reason for that simply is that all hospitals are different. So if you had a hospital in a place where there was lots of young, relatively healthy, perhaps affluent people, you probably get a lower crude mortality rate than if you had a deprived area with lots of older people living in it. And if you were trying to assess the quality of care between those two organisations and compare them, you would want to adjust them in some way. So if you imagine things like age, deprivation, or class, or the Jarman index, or a geodemographic measure, you'd want to adjust for the type of population that went through a hospital.
So what are the different measures of the adjusted mortality?
Well, so there's some history here. So there's a measure called HSMR, Hospital Standardised Mortality Rates, which was developed at Imperial College by a chap called Sir Brian Jarman, Paul Ayling and Alex Bottle, and that takes a whole range of metrics like age, gender, the type of admission, your diagnosis code, procedures that were done to you, your level of deprivation, any previous admissions you've had, the month of admission, because that's quite interesting, seasonally, and it takes a whole range of measures and kind of adjusts them in the same way that you would adjust anything. You know, if you think about adjusting the risk for car insurance, you're younger than I am, you statistically probably drive faster than I do, red cars crash more often than black cars, younger people crash more often than older people, and so on. So it's quite similar. Insurance companies do this a lot. They're trying to, what is the risk of, if Mark and Tom both went to hospital today with the same diagnosis, who's more likely to die? More Mark is, just because he's older. If you then overlay the fact that you've got multiple comorbidities, other things wrong with you, you suffer from diabetes or you've got a weak heart, then your risk of dying becomes higher than mine. You see what I mean? Yeah. So things like HSMR, there's another measure called RAMI, which a company called CHKS produce, similar but different. So they treat some different measures, like palliative care, they treat differently. And then over the last sort of 5 or 10 years, there's been quite a debate centrally within government about can you get to one measure, and also would you take into account things like people dying outside of hospital? Because if lots of people left a hospital but then quickly died, that would be different to if a lot of people left a hospital and survived. So there's a measure called SHIMI, which is provided by the Information Centre, or NHS Digital as they're now called, which takes into account if people died within 30 days of leaving. There's lots of subtleties and differences between these. It's like having 3 recipes for 3 different cakes. So the SHIMI, for example, uses much longer set of data to form its risks. It takes about 3 years worth of data into its model. Things like HSMR and RAMI, they tend to just take a year's worth of data, but from slightly different data points and treating variables slightly differently.
And different people have different favourites as well, like cakes.
They do, and I think if you made any recommendation, it would be that you look at things through a number of different lenses. So crude mortality is crude. It's a sensible measure to look at, perhaps on a run chart, you know, day by day, week by week, because you've got that data locally. So one of the issues with these adjusted measures is that they're only available within 6 to 8 weeks, and that's because you're compiling national data sets and then you're running a sort of a nationally built algorithm through it. So they would never be as responsive as a daily measure of crude mortality, but they should be a more accurate measure of kind of what to look at.
We've got about 5 minutes, so I think